Hello everyone, Willingdon here, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about playing against Jinteki Personal Evolution. No deck in Netrunner can leverage the hidden information aspect quite like Jinteki Personal Evolution, and it's easy to build up fear that every card you're going to run into is a snare. The biggest error that I see players make against PE is trying to avoid taking damage altogether. This simply isn't possible. Instead, you should focus on taking the damage at the right time. In this first section, we're going to look at how you can use credit awareness as well as hand management to mitigate the damage and try to take it at times where it doesn't have as much of an impact. The easiest way to avoid the nastiest surprises of Jinteki is to know their costs. In reality, there aren't that many traps, so let's try to go through most of the popular ones. Snare is the ultimate Jinteki trap, and one that we've all ran into more times than we'd like to mention. The 3 net damage can be brutal, but the tag is especially punishing as well, since you'll probably have to spend credits to deal with it. The most important thing to say about Snare is that it costs the corporation 4 credits. So if they don't have 4 credits, or you can engineer a situation where they won't have 4 credits, you don't have to worry about Snare. Another thing to mention is that even if it does hit you, 4 credits is a lot for most personal evolution decks to spend. Keep in mind while you're playing against PE that generally the weakest aspect of their deck is the economy. Another point to make about Snare is the fundamental rule of playing against Flatline. Don't run on the last click. This is mainly because if you get tagged from Snare, nasty things could happen to you on their turn. Plus, if you get hit for 3 cards, that could potentially put you into a death situation by Flatline. If you're going to access cards when your opponent has 4 credits or more, I'd recommend trying to do that on the first, second, or third click. That way, if you get snared, you can at least ditch the tag or draw a couple cards. Another type of scary trap that PE plays are advanceable traps. These are traps that they usually combine with Mushin Notion to quickly ramp up the power level. The scariest of the advanceable traps is Cerebral Overrider. This is mainly because if you get hit with a few brain damage at some point in the game, it's going to make it substantially easier for them to kill you with net damage later. Like with Snare, Cerebral Overrider is quite expensive to activate, costing 3. This means that if you make a run on the server and they don't have 3, you don't have to worry about Cerebral Overrider, although there's a bunch of other advanceable traps that we're about to talk about that you might need to worry about. Project Junebug only costs 1 to activate, and it can single-handedly flatline you if you're not prepared. And Aggressive Secretary and Shattered Remains are popular because they deal with anti-Jinteki cards that you might try to play. Though it's not exactly a trap, Neural EMP is another good card to watch the Corp credit pool for. Each copy of this card costs 2 to play, and this is one of the few ways that the Corp can deal damage to you on their turn other than the PE ID. Most PE decks play agendas that are difficult to steal. Usually this is in the form of Fetal AI and Future Perfect. Fetal costs the 2 directly to steal, and Future Perfect makes you play the Psy game if you're going to steal. Take note that both of these agendas have specific weaknesses. If Fetal is in the archives, you can score it without having to take the damage, and Future Perfect can be scored out of remote servers without having to play the Psy game. Another big reason that you should have a few credits if you're making runs against PE is that you're going to want to be able to trash cards that you access, especially Ronin. This is going to be their main way to deal with the fact that most players focus on R&D against Personal Evolution. We'll talk more about this later. If we combine together some of this information that we just talked about with credit management, we see that the best time to run against R&D, HQ, or unadvanced traps is when you have at least 2 credits and the corporation player has fewer than 4 credits. An important way to think about your deck and your hand against PE is that they are in some ways like your hit points or your life total. You don't want to lose a bunch of cards for no reason, and you want to make lots of decisions to try to maximize the number of cards that you'll end up with. Perhaps even more importantly is identifying which cards are actually important in the matchup, and which cards you can just let go to the wayside. Let me first say that the easiest way to protect valuable cards is to install them down to the table. PE doesn't have a whole lot of ways to remove things from play, but they have lots of ways to zap things out of your hand. Keep this in mind when you're drawing cards at the end of your turn. Are you going to draw into some card that's extremely valuable only to have it zapped from a scored agenda next turn? It's best to try to draw cards early in the turn. That way you have the information of which cards were drawn and how valuable those are. The first type of valuable card against PE are icebreakers. Of course, these are important in every Netrunner matchup, but I think we have a little different priorities against PE. Barriers are the least represented type of ice, and generally they're just end the run ice that are cheap to res. When it comes to fractors, think about if you have other ways in your deck to deal with these end the run ice. The code gates are generally in PE to stop you from running R&D so many times, although usually they play a few end the run code gates as well. The code gates in PE tend to have low strength, which means they're vulnerable to AI breakers or Parasite. This might mean that you don't need to focus on getting your code gate breaker as much. Sentries are the bread and butter of the PE ice setup. It's almost never wrong for you to play down your sentry breaker for later. The sentry that we're most concerned about avoiding is Koma Inu. This piece of ice makes it really dangerous to face check their ice, so I would recommend trying to have some way to deal with it if you're running against a corp that has a lot of credits. Even if it only hits you one time, that can potentially be very devastating. A big mistake I see people make against PE is to overvalue icebreakers that they don't particularly need. You don't want to play extremely passive just because there's some icebreaker that would ideally be a little better than a different icebreaker you might draw later. And a lot of times their entire ice setup can be beat just with parasites or AI breakers. Another category of important cards against PE are recursion effects. These are nice because they give you a little wiggle room on important cards that you need to play later. It's almost never the wrong play to get your clone chip down to the table early in the game to avoid losing it to net damage. And same old thing can be really nice for getting back those valuable events that you've played or lost. The last category of really important cards are dedicated cards that you play against Jinteki. Unlike Scorched Earth, Jinteki PE has a huge variety of cards that you can play, each with different advantages. Let's look at some of these now. The first cards that we're going to talk about are ways to directly prevent net damage. The appeal of these cards is quite obvious. Deus Ex is a really nice soft counter because it not only prevents a lot of net damage from Project Junebug or Snare or things like that, but it also lets you break a huge number of ice that other non-Jinteki decks play. If PE is a really fringe deck in your metagame, this might be the correct choice. But generally speaking, I don't think this card is good enough on its own to give you a really strong PE matchup. Deus Ex also relies on some type of recursion to be especially effective. If you don't play clone chips or other ways to recur it, this probably isn't the right choice for you. Net Shield and Feedback Filter are both nice choices because they allow you to prevent the damage that the corp does to you on their turn. This makes it a lot easier to protect your valuable cards in your grip. Feedback Filter has the added bonus of preventing brain damage against Cerebral Overrider. Feedback Filter also lets you leverage a credit advantage to find dangerous cards in the remotes, especially a Philotic Entanglement. Both of these cards are great choices if you can afford to support them, but your economy is going to have to be pretty robust to be able to sink credits into these over and over. Another common type of anti-Jinteki card are expose effects. These are really nice because it allows you to see what card your opponent just played with Mushin Notion. And in a pinch, they can also be useful for verifying that a specific piece of ice isn't Koma Inu. Keep in mind when you're playing your expose effects that Psychic Field is a pretty common card for PE to play. This can be a really nasty surprise if you're not expecting it. Another important card against PE is Levy AR Access. This is just going to let you get all of your stuff back and essentially reset your life total in that you'll have a whole new deck. I'd only recommend this card if you also have access to Same Old Thing or just want to play multiple copies of it. It's hard to just hold it in your hand until the right time to play it, since you're probably going to be taking a lot of net damage and might lose it. The final type of card we're going to talk about is R&D access effects. It can be pretty dangerous against PE to access a whole ton of cards on R&D all at once, but if you can continuously access 2 cards or maybe 3 cards every turn, it's going to be really hard for them to get the cards that they need to play down into the remote servers. The absolute best card at doing this sort of thing is Keyhole, since you don't even have to access the cards. If you get a Keyhole early in the game, you can just run them over and over with it and trash all their ice and other defensive cards so that they're going to have a lot of trouble dealing with the Keyhole. A good second best to Keyhole is R&D Interface, although I'm only going to recommend playing 1 copy of this card to the table. Accessing 2 cards lets you look a little deeper without really risking a huge amount of damage that could kill you. In closing, Personal Evolution can be incredibly tedious and nerve-wracking to play against. You really have to remain vigilant against them. You don't want to make a whole series of smart decisions for most of the game, and then suddenly lose because you made some boneheaded play. If you're aware of their tricks, and you play the right cards against them, PE is far less scary than it might initially seem. Well, that's going to do it for the video today. If you liked it, please press subscribe and the button that looks like a thumbs up, and I'll see you again for some more Netrunner stuff.